it in case it's misconstrued. Sound good?
That's great.
Cool. I'd like to welcome Dr. Jeff Anderson to the show. Dr. Anderson has worked on a number of research projects which are of interest to me, including autism and how it affects the brain, the sexual fluidity of heterosexual women who experience periodic same-sex attraction, the way that shortened sleep cycles affect our reward circuits, and perhaps most interesting to me, religious experience and how it affects the brains of bodies of those experiencing it. So welcome. I want to start by giving you a little space to tell us a bit about yourself. I know you recently moved to Oregon and you have some small changes in what you're researching right now. You've changed to private practice. Is that right?
That's right. So some actually really big changes. I've been a professor at the University of Utah for over 10 years, and I have now moved to Eugene, Oregon, where I am doing more clinical and translational work with neuroimaging in private practice.
Ah, okay. So I have all sorts of questions, but I think I want to start with religion to make sure that since that's the most important thing to me, that we have enough time to get to that. And I want to make sure I'm aware of your time. As someone who myself has had quite a few religious experiences, many of which I was wholeheartedly convinced at the time were unquantifiable in any sort of scientific terms, what is a religious experience and what's happening when somebody has one?
Well, that's just it, right? We change what we think of as a spiritual experience or a religious experience over time. And I think most people kind of have the sense that I know it when I feel it. When there's something ineffable, something that you can't explain, something that seems to defy any other reason but something supernatural. And these experiences are so convincing and so powerful, they're among one of the strongest drivers of human behavior.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. So I've read some of your research that you were a part of on religion, and I know you've done a lot of related research since. It actually looks like since the 2016 study that I read, that study has been advanced a little bit. So we can either focus on that study or if you've done some since. I know what you effectively do is you put people in neuroimaging machines and then expose them to different sorts of religious.
That's right. Well, this was a kind of a serendipitous project for me and a few colleagues. This is something that we'd wanted to do for many, many years. And the people seemed to kind of all be in the right place at the right time to try it a few years ago. And so what we wanted to do was to see if we could identify brain circuits that were related to religious and spiritual experience. And we decided to go about this by looking at a community of devout Mormons.
Yeah, which is an interesting choice that I assume this was at the University of Utah still, right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, so I assume had something to do with perhaps the easiest group to find a large sample to choose from. Was
Well,
there anything else specific in
maybe
who
the
you were
sample
looking?
chose us. So it turns out there were a lot of reasons why it was a really useful approach. This is a group of individuals who are very enthusiastic about participating in scientific research. They're positively disposed towards science, and that's a huge part of the Mormon tradition. And probably more important, these are individuals who'd all, at a young, healthy age, when they didn't have a lot of other medical problems or things that might interfere with brain imaging, had spent a year and a half to 2 years full time doing what they call a mission, which is full-time proselyting, and meaning that they had very similar training, and they were able to identify in their own minds what constitutes a religious experience. So the one thing that we need to be able to do successful neuroimaging is we have to have somebody be able to tell us, this is it, I'm feeling something right now that's profound. And they can recognize that, and they can tell us exactly when they are and when they aren't feeling it.
Yeah.
And for that particular task, a Mormon population is perfect.
That's actually something I hadn't thought about. I've read through this study pretty extensively, and I had realized that Mormons do present a pretty devout group of Christians. There's a lot to choose from, but that is unique in the way that I'm from charismatic background, and I think one of the things you would have run into had you tried to run these studies on my group of people is this sort of aversion to science. We sort of smell it
Mhm.
out from the get when I was still participating in that
Yeah.
organized religion.
Right.
We smell it out from the get as sort of fishy, and you're going to have a hard time convincing those folks. I imagine that had a lot to do with the success you had. I actually found myself wondering a few times if you had people in the MRI that may in fact be not real sure about whether or not they could trust you, or if that was something that arose in your analysis of the data you came up with.
Well, I don't know how to what extent people trusted us, but they were willing to participate. Interestingly, when we do research projects, uh, this was unlike anything we've ever done before, because when we started, we had it was very important to us that we did the project with a lot of transparency in the community, that people understood what we were about, and didn't attribute to us, false intentions of what we were looking to do, which was to understand spiritual experience. And so we held a town hall meeting, and we put out an announcement, and we had 3 television stations and about 1,000 people there in a couple of days, packed into this auditorium. I mean, this is completely unheard of. When we do a study in autism, we're lucky
Right.
to get 6 people interested that we're starting a project, and so there's a lot of interest,
Mm.
and there's enough people that are interested and also curious about their own feelings, like, what is it that I'm feeling? And they genuinely wanted to know what happened in their brain when they're feeling these experiences that to them are powerful and profound and meaningful.
And I'll be honest, the more I read into this, the more I walked away, not only surprised, but looking back on experiences that it's probably been 20 years since I really immersed myself with that same sort of forced belief that I
Mhm.
used to as a kid. I was sort of indoctrinated at a young age, but I stuck with it till 25. To look back on some of those things. And I think what I was expecting with your research is that you were going to identify that the reward circuits just go bananas when people exhibit, or when people are
Mhm.
experiencing any sort of religious experience. And it turns out not only was your research quite a bit more in depth than that, you weren't just looking for what happens, but from what I understand, there were a couple specific elements of the way this study was designed to figure out whether or not trust was increased through the process of religious experience. And you did that in some really interesting ways involving C.S. Lewis, from what I understand, from what I read on the study that I could get a hold of. But I think that that may be worth unpacking a little bit. What did you find when people were experiencing what they considered to be a religious experience?
Well, what we found was something that to me was kind of surprising, because we've done a lot of different types of populations based research. And when we look at we've looked at roshis from a Zen tradition, and
Hmm.
we've looked at all kinds of disease states. And the one thing that you just don't often see is a characteristic reproducible brain network that's active. Um, and we reproduced it with 3 separate experiments, exactly the same network. That to me was astonishing, how robust and how reproducible this set of brain circuits was. And it was an interesting set of brain circuits. Like you mentioned, the thing that caught our attention, and I think caught the imagination of the media, was the idea that the, the nucleus accumbens was active, which is responsible for dopamine processing and reward. But there was much more. There were circuits in the medial prefrontal cortex that have to do with valuation and judgment and moral reasoning. There were circuits in the insula that have to do with empathy and social reasoning. There were circuits in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that have to do with attention. There were circuits along the intraparietal sulcus, again, processing of attention. And all of these circuits combined, this attention, uh, reward, judgment, valuation, empathy, into a whole picture that time and again we could elicit that same set of circuits.
Yeah, So this only goes so far, but it reminded me of a few of the other things you're studying. Maybe the most pertinent is gambling. And I had noticed in one of your other
Mhm.
studies that you used gambling as a stand-in for reward mechanisms, or a way to think
Yeah,
about.
it's
And I
a
actually found myself thinking back to the casino and what sort of rewarding is going on in those situations, because I think it might involve a lot of those same circuits. So maybe that's a bizarre backdoor way of asking you, what's your takeaway from the parts of the brains that are turned on as far as it relates to other drugs or other rewarding activities like gambling?
so when we feel pleasure in the brain, there's really just one basic circuit that's involved. There's all kinds of nuance from things that are added on or combined with that. But but really, whether we're talking about maternal or parental love, or pair bonding, or gambling, or cocaine or methamphetamines, or all of the things that give us pleasure, appreciation of music,
Right.
all of those activate the same circuit. The nucleus accumbens is really at the heart of that.
Yeah.
And and the difference between an experience from, say, methamphetamines and one that's more complex, like you might get while you're hiking out in nature and feel a lot of those same feelings of well-being, pleasure, peace, reward, have to do with the timing of the activity. Is it, stimulus response, or is there something a little bit more um, uh, complex or nuanced about the timing of the stimulus and the response, the duration of the response? And those kinds of things make all the difference between something that we classify as addictive or something that we classify as healthy, like exercise or a runner's high. It just has to do with how complex and what types of other behaviors and brain circuits are engaged in addition to just reward.
Yeah, the obvious question looking forward is, now I think it's been 3.5 or 4 years since the study I stumbled on was published. The follow-up research that I believe was even alluded to in your study was, are the same networks that are active in the scenarios you're putting forth to Mormons also active in other religious experiences, even
Mm.
to the extent of people that we would classify as having negative religious emotions? And my thought went, we're stateside, so I was thinking abortion clinic shooters are much more in tune with the things we see in the States. But we also, I think the example in the article was somebody that's in ISIS. And what struck me as odd is that we might actually live in a country where you're not going to get 1,000 people to show up if you advertise that study. But do you know if anybody's attempted to take that step and to get somebody that would be willing, given that we live in a world with 4chan and 8chan, and it's actually pretty easy to track down at least names and faces of people who claim to believe some of this stuff?
Well, for me, that's a really strong hypothesis that you take, say, a Lutheran woman in the Midwest reading her Bible, or somebody contemplating religious violence as two polar extremes. I think the
Sure.
circuits in the brain have a lot of similarities. There are going to be a lot of the same areas that are engaged, and the differences are probably subtle, but probably also really important. And no, I don't know of anywhere that research. It's a really extremely hard research to do, and you take a stigmatized group and say, we're going to study why you're stigmatized. That's just a really uncomfortable place for a researcher to be, for all kinds of reasons.
Yeah.
And and so people have taken backdoor approaches. So I've seen a study, and I forget the authors on this, that looked at a lesion analysis, looking at religious extremism and religiously motivated violence in terms of population studies prevalence, and saying individuals who are uh, enamored to these groups, do they tend to have brain lesions associated with little strokes or other types of lesions in certain areas? And possibly, they found some areas in the posterior parietal lobe that might be related. But when it comes down to really answering the question, what are the differences between a healthy religious experience and one that's maladaptive? Uh, I don't think we know yet. One thing we tried was to look at guilt. We looked at, so with this population we had, one of the advantages is we could, once we had a response that we can measure, we were able to say, well, the individuals that had the most response or the least response, do they have differences in personality? Do they have differences in standardized psychometric measures of all kinds of different constructs? And for example, we found that when we looked at individuals that tended to report uh, more religious guilt as a part of their worldview, that they tended to have different brain circuits that were engaged when they were looking at quotations from religious leaders. And maybe it would be helpful just to kind of explain our paradigm for that.
Yeah.
You mentioned C.S. Lewis. What our paradigm was is we showed a number of quotations from world or Mormon specific religious leaders. And it would be a quotation that was religiously themed, and then under it would be the name of the leader attributed to in a photograph. And all of the quotes were actually from C.S. Lewis, and we randomized them to either Billy Graham or Pope Francis or Mormon apostles. And we found that across the board, there were orders of magnitude higher ratings for how meaningful is the quotation, how much spiritual feelings did it evoke when it was an in-group leader, one of their own authorities. Whereas for those individuals that experienced more religious guilt, we found a couple of interesting things. That there was an area in the orbitofrontal cortex, just above the eyes, that was much more active in those individuals that had religious guilt when it was one of their own leaders, and wondering if these people may have developed a response to messages from their leaders that involve some types of brain circuits that might be associated with pain or aversion. Others, we found that when they were looking at quotations from their own leaders, there was an area of the brain that wasn't as active. And that's in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is kind of right out to the side of the brain in the front. And that is an area of the brain that's typically engaged in reasoning, in pattern recognition, in analytical processes. And that was just less active when it was a message from one of their own leaders, as compared to when it was one of the outgroup leaders. They seem to scrutinize the content more carefully.
And that's really interesting. So I stumbled onto, there weren't images of how you presented these quotes in the article I read, but I did stumble onto, I think it was a YouTube video of somebody else discussing the same study, maybe one of your grad students. Mm-hmm. And what the image I saw had the picture of the author and the name of the author below the quote. And I'm not sure if that was accurate, but as a communication guy, what I immediately thought is, I wonder what would happen if you flipped the picture and the attribution to the top, because I found myself reading the quotes, and especially if I was already in the mindset of you're engaging in a study, pay attention, I think I may read the quote and actually try to evaluate the quote more, which is sort of aside from what we're talking about, but it did make me think, since we're talking about trust, I wonder if some of those folks read the quote, and if it was dead on, they didn't care who said it, but if it was a little bit, they didn't quite understand. Because what it sounds like is they almost would have had to read the author's name first, or at least glance down and see who said this, if they were going to have that same reaction in the brain, and we attribute it to the authorship.
Well, our timing isn't really rapid with fMRI, and so we would show each quotation for about 20 seconds, and the response is really more of an ensemble of brain activity over that 20-second interval. But the face thing was actually a little problematic in other ways. So another thing that we found was that an area of the brain that processes facial recognition, called the fusiform face area, was more active when pictures of outgroup leaders were shown. So when they were looking at a face of Billy Graham or Desmond Tutu, the fusiform face area was more active than one of their own leaders' faces was shown, which is a little counterintuitive, because most of the research on face recognition tasks shows that the familiar faces, famous faces, tend to elicit more activity in the fusiform face area.
Right.
But here it was the opposite. And at the same time that the fusiform face area was more active for these outgroup leaders, we also saw activity in the amygdala, which is associated with emotion, threat,
Yeah.
um, powerful emotional responses.
Yeah. So you're almost hinting at it, or not. Maybe I'm misreading you, but what do you take away from that?
Well, the simplest explanation to me is that when we're seeing messages attributed to outgroup leaders, uh, we're more wary of the source.
Yeah.
We scrutinize the content more
Yeah.
unconsciously.
Yeah.
And, and we even feel some sense of alarm, perhaps, at internalizing a message when the source may not be someone from within our own tribe.
Right. Yeah, actually, that's exactly what I'm again placing myself back in my religious upbringing, and there's certain people that are just considered. You're taught really early they are a no-go. They are dangerous. I could imagine looking at a face if I just read a quote that seemed like it may have a tidbit of goodness in it, and I wanted to make sure it wasn't poison. I can imagine turning that part of my brain on and scrutinizing that image to make sure it wasn't one of the few people that I knew from my childhood. You can't pay attention to that person. So that is sort of what that makes me think, is it wasn't so much a process of trying to recognize to really attribute the quote. It may have been more a process, especially with the amygdala firing up, of trying to make sure this wasn't one of the people that you really needed to be wary of.
I think since our study over the last 4 years, there's been a pretty broad awareness throughout the whole world of how much of a role tribal loyalty plays
Right.
in our behavior, in our politics, in our
Yeah.
social interactions, and it's so foundational.
Yeah.
And these unconscious emotional responses related to tribe affiliation, they go really deep.
Yeah, I feel like, again, to tie back to the religious experience I have, that is maybe the pivotal thing that keeps you coming back, even if you're at a point when you're not getting the enjoyment that you always get, or when you're having a rough week. There is this social feeling. One of the ways I've heard it described, this goes all the way back to Freud, and I think he stole it, but as this oceanic feeling of oneness. And what I heard described, again, I'm not sure. I've done a lot of reading on what you've done on this topic, and there was some other authors, so some of what I read may have been from them. But the experience of religion, if I remember right, was described as two equal parts, one being like a social feeling of connectedness to something bigger than yourself, and
Mhm.
social wasn't the word used, but
Yeah.
something bigger, and then generosity, this also portion of like feeling like you really want to give back to the world. So I'm hearing sort of your descriptions of how that plays out, and wondering if there's anything you want to add on those two notes. I don't know if that's a legitimate explanation of
Yeah.
how religion might be
I
summed
have
up.
to be a little bit careful in trying to separate facts. I mean, things that we can prove in our research and ideas about what it might mean in a larger context that can be subjective, and other people might have different interpretations about. But a related note to what you're saying has to do with the emergence of religious belief and practice. So if you look at the types of brain circuits that are engaged in religious experience, um, there's a lot of the classical conditioning literature that is really relevant. So let's say that you were starting a religion and you wanted this to be a viable religion that people could benefit from. Well, heuristically, what you want to be able to do is to pair things that induce reward, like music, social stimuli, um, family relationships, and a doctrine or an idea.
Yeah.
Because by association, by pairing, a scriptural passage or an idea with a musical selection that we already know induces reward in the brain, and you keep making that link, between music or in some cases, mind-altering substances like peyote.
Yeah.
And then this doctrinal idea. And it's a very small leap to understand how those doctrinal ideas then can take on the ability to induce reward independent of any of those other paired associations.
Yeah, it probably isn't too much of a stretch. As I was reading through the research, I kept thinking of it as a unconscious hot wiring of the brain. In some
Yeah.
ways, it wasn't so much that reward is happening and then people are recognizing, oh, good, this is rewarding, so much as in a way they figured out a way that when they're exposed to certain stimuli to flip the switch. And like you said, it's not just the nucleus accumbens and straight dopamine. It's an experience. It's immersive. And again, I find myself every time I try to talk about it from a scientific perspective, my body goes back into those situations, because part of the magic of it is it feels like it's not really reducible to terminology. And it turns out that it is. I mean, everything we're talking about is dead on, but that's sort of the magic of it, is that you don't want to talk about it in terminology. So one of the other things I noticed in this study, if I read it right, was that these images of quotes that were from C.S. Lewis, but they were attributed to one of 6 people, 3 that were in group, so Mormon in this case, and 3 that were out group, were then shown for 8 minutes or 6 minutes or so. And then there was this separated period where the people that were in the MRI were asked to like mindfully or spiritually pray and focus on God. What was the purpose of that?
Well, one of the techniques that's become really powerful in studying the brain is something called functional connectivity. And functional connectivity is a new way of doing functional imaging. Not quite so new anymore, but the idea is that we can measure which regions of the brain activate together. And if you take the old paradigm where you put somebody in the scanner, you give them a task to do, like you show them pictures of something specific or have them move their finger, we can see which part of the brain is responsible when that happens. But if we just put them in the scanner with their eyes closed and tell them not to do anything,
right,
then what we can do is over an extended period of time, we can make statistical measurements about which regions of the brain are synchronized, just the noise in the brain activity. So if 2 areas of the brain tend to activate at the same time, then we infer that there's a relationship or a connection between those regions. And this technique has become very powerful to where we can map out tens of millions of connections in the brain simultaneously with quantitative measurements of how strongly connected brain regions are. And we can infer relationships about disease, neurodevelopment, and brain function and anatomy. And so what we were hoping to do was to look at extended periods of time and look at changes in the wiring between brain regions, or things that become rewired or more strongly associated in one condition than in another. And so a period of extended prayer was a really nice control task for a period where they were just kind of letting their mind go blank, or just letting the mind wander.
Okay. And so they went into the MRI, they were shown these quotes that were C.S. Lewis, which, complete side note, but did you have any participants that recognized any C.S. Lewis quotes? As somebody that read a lot of C.S. Lewis, it makes me wonder if 1 or 2 of them would have made me.
Yeah, the thing is that it was sort of deliberate on our part because, all of us, or at least 3 of the 5 of the core authors on this study, had a Mormon background. We grew up Mormon. We were immersed in the tradition. We knew, virtually everything about the Mormon experience from an inside perspective. And so we knew growing up that when we listened to talks by these LDS leaders, that they routinely quote C.S. Lewis. And so it's not at all a stretch to think of these quotations as being sort of attributed or sort of borrowed from C.S. Lewis, because it happens all the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. And if I remember right, C.S. Lewis is at times like referred to as the 13th apostle or
Yeah,
something to
that's right.
certain Mormon. So I understand that. I was actually, I thought the other way, but you're right. It may well, even if somebody recognized it, they might say,
That
oh, I
wouldn't
remember a
have
pastor saying.
been thinking, oh yeah, that sounds like something that he would
Yeah.
say.
And to be fair, he does. He talks like somebody that lived a long time before he did.
Yeah.
So, so I noticed in there too, if I read it right, you excluded 40-year-olds plus. Was there a reason for that?
Well, we start to see other things in brain imaging. We want to have as homogeneous a sample as possible. So uh, when we look at differences in brain activity, the more different our participants are, the more reasons there are for those differences that we see, and it makes it harder and harder to find consistent findings. So that's always an age-old conflict in research is, do
Yeah.
you try to have a really tight homogeneous sample where when you see something, it's likely to be what you think it's
Yeah.
related to,
Yeah.
or do you try for a broader sample so when you see something, it's more likely to be reflective of the whole population rather than an idiosyncrasy of the group you've chosen? And there were at least two factors why we chose a younger population. One is because this mission experience is really formative. All of our participants were returned missionaries,
Hmm.
and the closer you are to that experience, we think the more of a similar type of brain mechanism we would expect to see. The other is once you start getting over 40, I mean, the truth is there's a steady slope where you just lose brain volume from age 20 all the way to age 100. And the older you get, we older people have things that crop up in the brain, neurodegeneration. We have
Yeah.
I mean, younger is easier
Yeah.
from a scientific point of view if it's appropriate.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. The fireworks show is maybe easier to see. And the last thing I'll ask you about this study, it sounds like the last thing they did is run back another set of quotes falsely attributed. And I wasn't sure if they even looked to see if there was any differences in the trust level. But you had mentioned that when out of network leaders were attributed with these quotes, people had different regions of their brains fire up, including the amygdala, which is sort of associated with a panic or a fear response. And then they went into this 30-minute prayer session where they stayed in the machine. And then it sounds like another 24 quotes were showed to them. Were the responses any different the second time after they'd gone through this period of meditation? Did they find themselves like in a state of peace, or did they find themselves more resistant to these
They
messages?
were. And so one of the things that we did in between, it wasn't just a period of prayer. We also showed some video clips.
Okay.
And the Mormon Church really did the heavy lifting for us there. They have clips called Mormon messages that are designed to be tearjerkers, that are evocative, that are spiritually, they've already been calibrated to be exactly the sort of messages that people respond to. And so we showed a lot of those, and we actually had people push a button when they were feeling peak spiritual responses during that period. And we were able to calculate the timing of dopamine, I mean, of the nucleus accumbens activity to, within a second of when they pushed the button, we'd see a peak just a second before they pushed the button in that nucleus accumbens area. It made us very confident that what we were seeing was really related. And then when we looked at the same quotations, a replication study, we found the same thing. I mean, the same circuits that were active, the same spiritual network in the brain, but there were some subtle differences. And one of the differences was that the outgroup leaders, they were more likely to see quotes from outgroup leaders as also spiritually meaningful. So perhaps through this period of time, they became more open to ideas that were out of tribe. Maybe there's a training effect or a short-term practice effect um, that might decrease the ethnocentricity of their religious experience.
Yeah, that's an interesting addition. Okay, is there anything else I'm missing? I know it was a big study, and it sounds like actually there's been some stuff since. So either something I missed or anything that's happened
Yeah,
since.
I haven't thought about it for just a little bit. There's maybe one other little piece, and that is we also wanted to look at worldview. So it when you have this spiritual response, it's probably just a little bit different from person to person.
Mhm.
Some regions are expressed more strongly than others. For example, the insula. And when we looked at moral values, and we used Jonathan Haidt's schema here of fairness, reciprocity, and, and found that for some of those moral values, they seem to co-vary with how much insula activity people had during their spiritual response. Very specific to that area that processes emotion, empathy and social reasoning. And that seemed to people who engaged that area as part of their spiritual response more tended to have different moral values, where they were more concerned with harm and care to others. And we thought that was interesting because it may be that the way that we experience a spiritual response has a lot to do with the values that we hold.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the questions I actually thought about asking, so I'll go ahead and pose it, is because it's related. Do you have any suggestions on harm reduction strategies for those of us that still practice religion? I know that sounds weird to a lot of people listening, and to a lot of
Yeah,
us listening, it doesn't sound weird at all.
of course. I don't know. I think that when you look at something as complex as a religious response, um, the only take-home message for me is that I can't tell you to what extent that's a healthy response or or not, because so much of it depends on context.
Yeah.
And I think that it's that people are told in many contexts to trust our feelings, but I think it's also wise to not always trust your feelings,
Hmm.
because a lot of things can feel the same.
Yeah.
And things have to pass the sniff test. If you're going to start giving money to a cause, or you're going to pattern your life after an idea, I don't think it's wise to do that just because it feels good. I
Yeah.
think you also need some analysis of the content of the message, whether these are moral ideas you're espousing, whether it is something that is going to bring you and others happiness. And I think you can't just base your feelings on this instinctual, ineffable experience, because it can be deceptive, and that's how people get into trouble.
Yeah. How much pushback on this study did you get? You mentioned you grew up Mormon, so I was going to ask you about your religious background. It sounds like that's a big chunk of it. Did you get pushback on this from your family? That, again, I know charismatic Christianity is a long shot aside from a few tenets, but I know that if I was involved in a study like this, that would be something that they would immediately be saying, even as I assured them, this is not some backhanded attempt to like discredit religion. We're trying to figure out what's going on in the brain. I would be worried that they would have seen that as a delegitimization of the religious experience or the
So we
spiritual
had
experience.
pushback on every side. When it was released, the whole story just went bananas. I'd never seen anything like this in my career, where within a week, I think we were featured on The Onion and talked about by Miley Cyrus on Good Morning America,
Hmm.
and at the same time, we were having tabloids in the UK talk about how religion is nothing different than drugs, sex, and rock and roll. There was a state legislator who was saying these guys are just trying to take down Mormonism, and actually made a threat to the University of Utah that they would revoke funding unless they shut me down, which they didn't do, to their credit. There was also pushback from within the Mormon community and without. So while Richard Dawkins was tweeting out, "Haha, this just shows that religion is fake," there were also people from within the church, and the people who were most interested in the study across the board were Mormons.
Yeah.
And a lot of what the pushback we got from that side was not pushback, but a lot of the observations that surprised me from the Mormon community were people, not just one person, many people who in conversations came to the realization, well, so this is what happens in the brain when I feel the spirit. What if other people feel that too?
Right.
What if it's not unique to Mormonism?
Right.
And that was one of the more troubling aspects for many people within the Mormon community.
Strange, but I think that might even go back to the tribalism you were talking about, because why on earth would both things, why would either one of them bother you? But I run into the same thing every time I mention religion and say the word drug or say the word how. I mention how incredible it was to immerse myself in some of the like weekend retreats I would go on, and how we are charismatics. I don't know if you've come to any of our churches. I'll take you sometime. It is the party. We are, I mean, if you're talking about mainlining religion, we are all in. And when you look at what happens when people speak in tongues, it's a far cry from the religious experience you're talking about. We actually, to a large degree, as you know, turn portions of our brain off, and we sort of speak without speaking, and it might be thought of as a bit of like mindless meditation or turning
Yeah.
parts off and just sort of letting it go on autopilot. But it is intoxicating. So one of
Yeah.
the things I've run into and been really confused from my people, I might understand it more from other denominations, but from charismatics, is that when I refer to it as a drug, a lot of them are still angry and up in arms. And I think it's exactly what you're talking about. There's this concern that if we uncover what is happening in the brain and body when we feel these things, it discredits it somehow. And I for the life of me, as somebody that grew up as a Christian, cannot understand why that would be a problem. I mean,
Yeah.
most folks that are religious of any sort believe that God created humans to have all these switches and knobs and fearfully and wonderfully made. What on earth problem would you have with knowing that the system works the way that you think it was designed? But there's this fear. I've run into it too.
Here's another example. So when I go to conferences, there's often a talk or two about uh, aesthetic experience or the
Mm-hmm.
perception of art. So if you were to go to an art museum and somebody were to tell you, when you respond to a painting, that these areas of the brain are active, it's not threatening to people. But if you say that same thing about a religious experience,
Right.
it can be deeply threatening. And it's fascinating to me why that's the case, why people uh, are so much more threatened by a mechanistic or naturalistic response to religious feelings than
Yeah.
they are to other types of aesthetic pleasure.
Yeah,
Um,
and maybe that's where the comm scholars and the social justice warriors need to maybe pick this research up, because I would imagine it's got to be something to do with just the construction of most Western religions. I hate to essentialize all religions as anywhere near what I grew up with, but there is usually this idea of defensiveness of everybody else is wrong to at least some degree. Some of them have got it way wrong. And a lot of folks that come in here may be outsiders that are trying to infiltrate or spread, bad seed and different messages that can be considered poisonous if you're a member of most religions. So it makes me wonder if that, I don't know, if it just sort of pollutes the overall message and we think that any diagnosis is naturally poison.
it speaks to identity. You know, your religion becomes an
Hmm.
enormous part of your identity for so
Yeah.
many. And so it feels personal
Yeah.
when somebody questions the authenticity of a religious experience.
It makes sense. It is. It's just, as you said, art, any other drug you can put on the list as well. Nobody would feel that way if you talk to them about their trip on fentanyl last week or their MDMA therapy. They would in fact be thrilled to know the mechanisms that allowed them to have this therapeutic breakthrough. But there's just something different there. And I mean, I guess it just makes sense when you're thinking of how intricate the religious experience is, but it's still hard to jump over. So it's good to know I'm not the only one that's run into that, but it's also a bummer to hear that you faced such a big hurdle. That may be the reason why a lot of these studies aren't really persisting. It's been 4 years and there isn't
The
really a
bigger
big,
reason is nobody funds it, right?
right.
There's the Templeton Foundation that has a very clear agenda of their own and
Yep.
on specific types of research. But as far as if you think about how much research has been done on what happens in the brain related to spirituality, it's a tiny handful of studies.
Yep.
You know, orders of magnitude, many orders of magnitude more study has been done on our sense of smell.
Yep.
And yet this is, the most important part of big cultural movements
Right.
of enormously consequential uh, types of human behavior.
Yeah.
And yet nobody funds it because rightly the NIH is focused on disease, the NSF, government agencies, you quickly get into trouble when you try to do research that can be politicized.
Yep.
And so there just really isn't a mechanism to fund this kind of research. And so like in our case, we basically just did it on a shoestring budget as a passion project. It wasn't a funded study.
It's funny how the machine sometimes has these little nooks and crannies built in where you can sort of, eke out a project just because all the infrastructure is already there. So,
Yeah.
so I want to be cognizant of your time, but I also know that you have some other really cool projects, and you even mentioned something about nitrous oxide treatment of some sort. Did I hear you right last week?
Yeah. We were ready to go in March, and then we kind of hit a roadblock. So as soon as we can scan people again, we have the paradigm all ready to go. So this is kind of an interesting backstory here. So the reason I'm interested in studying nitrous oxide is because of my wife's dentist appointment.
Hmm.
So my wife was getting a tooth extracted, and and she went to the dentist. They asked her if she wanted nitrous oxide. Sure, why not? And she had this amazing transcendental experience that blew her away. Like love for the world, love for everyone, feelings of enormous power and meaning, and and that went away as soon as the drug stopped. And so she told me about it. I thought, I'm sure somebody knows something about this. And I
Yeah.
looked, never been studied. Nobody's ever looked at the brain and nitrous oxide. And it's an easy thing to do. So I thought we'll try it.
Yeah.
And see. But
And so right now you're waiting on some
we're waiting for we
okays to
can
do
bring
that.
people in and to where they feel safe that they're not going to get sick.
Oh, well, you let me know when you need me to fly out to Oregon. I'll hop in that machine in a second. That's not a
That
problem.
was going
So,
to be done in Salt Lake still, but
oh, that's fine. I can get out to Salt Lake too. Yeah, I'm due for a trip. So, no, good luck with that. That sounds really interesting. It's sort of this new frontier where we're seeing drugs that have been thrown on the trash heap of like Timothy Leary's big mouth for 40 years now, and there's starting to be. I got a ketamine therapy
yeah.
advertised at 5 or 6 different areas or different locations in the area. MDMA therapy is picking back up, and yet there's still this huge misunderstanding. I think most of the people I talk to and mention MDMA therapy think that
Yeah.
it's a quackery. You go meet a
No,
doctor and he gives
ketamine
you
is
a pill.
fascinating. Psychedelics are fascinating. And important. These are important drugs, and the anesthesia community knows this. This isn't a secret anymore. There's no stigma about these drugs in anesthesia and psychiatry. I mean, this is a big deal, and it kind of parallels what's happening with cannabis. That's another study that we're working on. We haven't. Again, as soon as we can, we're ready to turn the corner on that and start collecting data. Um, where that one's already funded and ready to go. But
Yeah, can you tell us a little about that one?
yeah, so we're looking at a couple of different things. This is funded by the Holistic Research and Education Foundation. This is a foundation that really is promoting rigorous, high quality, cutting edge research into mechanisms of cannabis, and uh, especially on the brain and health. And what we want to do is try to answer some questions like, why do people respond differently? Why do some people have a response to one strain or
Yeah.
another, and other people don't? Why is there so much difference in the potency to individuals? And then we want to understand, um, it's surprising, we know, which receptors THC and CBD act on.
Yeah.
We don't know what the whole response is in the brain. It's mostly responses that are done in animal models or in vitro.
Yeah.
And as I got into this over the last 2 years, I have understood why. The regulatory hurdles
Yeah.
for cannabis research are unbelievable.
Yeah.
So much work and so much expense just getting through the regulatory
Yeah.
process.
Yeah. Yeah. And it sounds strange, but that was really the instigation of this podcast is that with COVID showing up, I imagine the opioid crisis we're in right now, the deaths are only going to increase as we all crawl into our
Mhm.
holes and stay at home and our conditions go untreated or they get worse. And I think cannabis is just one area of research. Just like I said, these other Pandora's boxes, the more tools we can access and get out of the scrap pile of dangerous, and yet the stigma is still there. The thing I've been focusing on a lot lately is that we're going to have to it's going to be really hard to overcome that stigma because there's this huge complex of rehab and warriors on the war on drugs and special police departments that have worked their asses off to get these jobs after 20 years of following the police rules. They get the good paid job and the special unit to search for drugs and arrest drug criminals. All this stuff's going to go away. The prisons are going to empty out. The prison guards are going to get fired. There's a lot of reasons that you're encountering all these hurdles, but slowly the dominoes are falling. So I do have a little bit of hope.
And DEA is a great example. And, there's a different culture now in medicine, and science and medicine, move not really quickly, but probably more quickly than government and things like this. And even 10 years ago, there was a reason why the dominant agency that funded research into cannabis and drugs like this is called the National Institute for Drug Abuse.
Mm-hmm.
That's the perception that the goal was to understand why these drugs are addictive and how they harm us. And so now that's not what the FDA believes.
Right.
That's not what NIDA believes. That's not what physicians, by and large, believe, except for in little pockets that are influenced by politics. As by and large, we I think as a medical community are starting to see therapeutic applications of cannabinoids.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and again, I want to make sure I'm being aware of your time. Is there anything, I have this list of other studies that you've been involved in between autism and the gambling study with sleep, and I think the most recent one that's been published, which is sort of fascinating from a social communication perspective, but heterosexual women and homoerotic attraction at times. Is there maybe one you want to pick and share a little bit with us if you have time?
Dealer's choice. I mean, they're all fun.
I honestly, my questions about the most recent one you did is how in the world did you get approval to run this study?
You mean show porn in the scanner?
Yeah, exactly. And not only that, to test what arousal would be, because apparently you were testing arousal by some mechanism that it wasn't really specified in the study publication, but it kind of was. It was definitely alluded to.
No, we also had a pressure monitor, in the, a genital pressure monitor
Uh,
for women
yeah.
this was I have to say first off that this was a study that I collaborated and helped
Yeah.
with, but really the brains behind the study were my collaborators, Jana Dickinson. She just did, it was her passion to get this study off the ground, and she did an amazing job of setting it up, and I helped with the imaging piece, and that turned out to be really interesting. But yeah, she really managed to shepherd that through the regulatory process, and honestly, that's not that difficult to get approval to do a study like that.
Mm.
I mean, people understand that this is of import, and that was much less challenging than a lot of the other studies we've done.
Mm. Cool. So I recognize our time is up. I do, like I said, I want to make sure I leave plenty of room for you to talk about anything you want. Is there anything you got going on? Anything I've missed that like you'd love to share that I'm sure would be just as fascinating as the other projects? You just seem to stumble into some of the coolest projects.
Yeah.
Stumble is the wrong word. I'm sure it is strategic, but your resume seems like it's a smorgasbord of unrelated things until you look closely and realize, no, there is a thread that weaves all of these neurological subjects together. So
Yeah, we're interested in understanding things that matter to people,
yeah.
things about the brain that it's so easy to continue to do research the same ways that we've done before, to study Parkinson's disease
Yeah.
or Alzheimer's disease. These are important topics. Of course, we need to study those, but there was something that was one of the formative events of my career was when I was still in graduate school, it was back, the first volume of Nature Neuroscience was just coming out. And I remember reading an editorial that said something, I'm paraphrasing, something to the effect that there is probably more about neuroscience that is challenging to society, to the human condition, than there is from all of the other great conflicts about science and religion.
Yeah.
There's probably more threats perceived from neuroscience than there is from things like evolution um, or
Yeah.
you know, what's the place of the earth and the cosmos.
Yeah.
And these issues are really important. And if neuroscientists will not speak out on important, challenging, and controversial topics
Yeah.
with the special knowledge and perspective that they have, one of many,
Yeah.
then other people will do so on their behalf. And so from the beginning, I made a commitment that I wasn't going to shy away from difficult, challenging topics
Yeah.
that were important for humanity to understand, because we need people that have those skills and training. They're willing to look at them from that point of view and share that information.
Yeah, so if you're out there considering a medical career, don't rule this one out. So I appreciate everything you're doing. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down. I imagine in the future, I'll probably touch base with you again if this goes the way that I think it will. And I guess that's it. I thank you for your time.
Thanks.
Yep.
Pleasure.
Let me know if you, like I said, if you ever need somebody for these studies you're talking about, cannabis and nitrous oxide are both right up my alley. So I can hop on a plane whenever you're ready to do it.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Anderson.
Take care.
Bye.